So we've got this colonies game here, and what you get this time is either a thin strip of paper or a small card that outlines the environment on the different squares. And the environment is going to be broadly defined. It's going to have information about the landform, the soil, the animals that live there, and so on, especially the card version, because it's a little bit more elaborate. And like Dave said, you can either choose the strip version, which is very condensed, and then you make up additional information, or you give them the card version, and it's got a little bit more information. Dave mentioned that I was in at the beginning of, I was a reviewer very early on in the development of the Oregon Trail. And we did learn some things about that. And one of the things is to keep focusing on what is your one essential question. And the essential question in this round is, how do I survive in this place where my ship landed? Because we all know that not every ship that came over here landed where they wanted to. Plymouth Colony was actually aiming for Georgia and landed in Massachusetts. That's kind of a ways away. So how do you survive once you get there? You're going to have some information, then you've got to bring your background knowledge. Now, in the United States, if you take a look at a group of kids there, they've got a fair amount of background knowledge about the weather. They know what it likes to feel cold and hot and rainy and snowy and so on. They knew a little less about rocks, which ones are hard, which ones are good, a little bit less about water, and they generally know almost nothing about soil or things like tides that turned out to be very important back in the colonial days. That puts me onto a little card that I have, which are things that we keep saying or writing in our standards, even though we know they're not true. And Dave mentioned one of them. We keep talking about triangular trade, but it wasn't anything like a triangle. We talk about the tropical rainforest, but the rainforest is actually on the equator. If you go on the tropic line, it's a desert. We talk about the mid-Atlantic region. We wound up giving you guys a card that talks about all the different things that are called the Mid-Atlantic region, depending on what book you pick up. World history people talk about the Nile River and how the floods made it the soil rich. And that's exactly backwards. You've got a video that talks about the indigenous people living in the desert Southwest. And again, that's just not true. And people keep saying the soil in New England is so thin and rocky. Well, if your notion of thin is 400 feet thick, that's not the problem with the New England soil. So for the next 15 minutes, we're actually going to give you the tools to do the background for that colonies game about the environments in the different parts. And like Dave said, we're not doing it just to solve a fifth grade GLIC. It turns out that the environmental differences, particularly the soil quality, the agricultural potential, and the prevalence of diseases, these things wind up costing us dearly when it comes to the Civil War. They're both part of cause and consequence of the Civil War. So we've got a handful of PowerPoints, and like all the PowerPoints, they're a little bit too long. One of the PowerPoints is about tide mills, because this was a key difference north and south. A tide mill is a mill that gets its power from the ocean tides, and you can use it to grind grain, saw wood, run machines, crush rock, whatever. This is what a tide mill looks like, and we'll just basically give you a picture. And you'd let the tide in, and then the tide would go over that wheel, and it would turn it, and you would have a mill. We put a map on your clickable map, but we also give you a handout version of it. This is the number of feet of the tide mill, of the tides in different parts of the East Coast. And they range from a high of 10 and 11 and 12 up in Maine to a low of 2 and 3 when you get down around Washington, D.C. It turns out that you need about 5 feet of tide in order to run a mill, which means New England had a source of power to saw wood, to grind grain, and so on. The mid-Atlantic area, particularly the Virginia area, did not have that source. Now, where do we find this information? The next 11 slides on this PowerPoint are for the handful of teachers that want to make a science inquiry lesson out of this too. If you're not going to do the science inquiry, then you don't even want to bother looking at these particular ones, and I'm not going to spend any time looking at them. But you can find really interesting information about it. And now you can talk a little bit about how people design a graph and so on. But you get a tide chart for different places. So that brings me back to the clickable map here. The tide range is actually one of the layers on your clickable map. And you want to clue in your students when they get their colony location that they might want to check whether they could grind grain, saw wood, and so on, or whether they have to find another source of power. Dave mentioned a little bit about the fact that tobacco was grown in a particular kind of soil here, but it's in a region that has almost no tidal power, so they had to actually ship their tobacco up to New England in order to get it processed before they would ship it over. And it started to set up your Hamilton versus Jefferson argument about, are we an urban nation or are we a rural nation? And other buttons will turn on other important characteristics. One of them is these two weird words, photosols and ultrasols. And with that, I'm at the end of that PowerPoint. I could set another one up here, start this one from the beginning. Do I have to hit display settings again? Dave?
Yes. Yes, you do. Yep.
Okay. This is a 45-frame PowerPoint that is almost entirely for your background, because you're a typical American that you probably don't know very much about soil, unless you're like Dave, where you've got your own garden, and then you've got a view of soil that is fixed in your location. And the whole important point about soils is that good soils are made, they're not found, and they're made by the environment that you have in a particular place. We call it the Goldilocks theory. It's not too hot, not too cold, not too wet, not too dry. So we'll start with a couple short quotations as to why you should even do this. The first one is like a bumper sticker. All human life, schools, stadiums, courtrooms, fine wines, TV shows, everything depends on 2 feet of good soil. And if you don't have it, you don't have it. Because it doesn't rain anywhere and only a few places have really good soil. The second quotation, particularly useful in West Michigan here, Dutch Reformed areas, or in parts of the South, or in where I grew up in Minnesota. Just about every religion has a story about soil. That the sower went out to sow his seed and they fell on the path, the rock, the thorns, and so on. What makes a good soil? And that's what the PowerPoint's about. Soil does not come from the rock. In fact, in most cases, it doesn't matter what the rock is. Soil is the result of the interaction of that rock with the climate, the slope, the animals, the plants, and so on. And if any of those conditions change, you get a different soil. So the right question to ask, and the question that your students would want to ask when they find their colony location, is what are your conditions here? If a place is really cold, rocks don't break apart, and you just don't have any soil. If a place is usually cold, but sometimes goes above freezing, then these processes work very slowly and you wind up with a very rocky soil. If a place is really hot and rainy, those processes work really fast and they turn almost every kind of rock into the very simplest chemical compounds, iron oxides, aluminum, and so on. And as you know, iron oxide is rust. So you're not surprised to find that the soil down there is rust colored and it's not able to hold nutrients. In other words, you can't even fertilize this soil. As a result, the best yield of corn in South Carolina is about 120 bushels per acre. And on my farm in Wisconsin, I would have called that a crop failure. In fact, and it goes on to tell you know, how it can form even something that's almost as hard as a rock just by being in that environment. If a place is dry, salt will tend to accumulate in the soil. And excess salt is a big problem in a dry soil. In fact, one benefit of the Nile River floods was to wash the salt out of the soil to make the soil less fertile and therefore able to support crops, because with too much salt in the soil, that was toxic. If a place is really rainy, excess water carries the nutrients out of the soil. That's a process called leaching, and it's the problem of northern Michigan. So if you stop and look at this map of cropland value, where the blue parts of the map are the cropland that's worth more than $2,000 per acre, it's got a very small part of the United States. That a whole lot of the United States is either too hot, too rainy, too cold, or too dry to make a good soil. Now, that's the price of the soil for agriculture. You can have the land cost more if you happen to be next to a city and somebody wants to build a Walmart on it or something. PowerPoint goes on to talk a little bit about the role of floods and how they can make things a little bit different. But the real point is just, it's very hard to make a good soil. You need places with conditions that are just right. And in the original colonies, the conditions were just right for about 5% of the area in eastern Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and a little bit of New York. In fact, if you look at a world map, the United States actually has the biggest block of good soil in the entire world. So we've got an exception at the end about the Black Belt of Alabama. That's going to become important a little bit later on. I'm just going to point out that this is an environment where the climate would make a bad soil, but a particular rock or a flood can make a good soil within that bad soil. And that turns out to be where the plantation areas were. Like I say, you can look at the PowerPoint on your own and find out more about it if you want. But the fact of the matter is, there just isn't very much good soil. And the eastern part of the United States is by and large too rainy, and it's too cold up north, and it's too hot down south. And the result is there's just not very much good soil anywhere on the East Coast. So that's two. And I'm trying to see where I am on my time here.
You are just fine.
The third one is one that they might actually have had. Now I'm trying to figure out why I'm not even seeing how to start the slideshow. Maybe if I punch the button, it'll start. There we go. Display settings one more time. There is a chance that they will have looked at this one in 4th grade. It is also available in 8th grade. The big idea is, what is a region? And how can we use that knowledge to talk about North America? So a region is a group of places that are like each other and close to each other. So you can draw a line around them and say, this is what, you know, this is the hardwood region, or this is the grassland region, or this is the desert region. Why do we make regional maps like that? Is because it's easier to remember the shape of the region. If your kids have not done this, and we actually make region maps in 3rd grade giants about nut trees and pine trees in Michigan, about Ojibwe settlements and things like that. Let's make a regional map of North America. Now, North America is a great big continent. It's bigger north-south than any other continent, which means it's got a huge range of different environments in it. And the idea is how to figure out how to make this easy to remember. And the answer is we can draw 4 lines on this map, and we basically have told what the place is like. Line number 1 starts at the tip of Alaska and goes to the east coast of Mexico. In other words, it's very easy to remember, and this basically divides the United States into the old rocks and the young rocks. The young rocks are in a mountainous region because of the processes that made the young rocks. The old rocks are basically a plains region. Now, there are some exceptions to the rule. The PowerPoint talks about the exceptions. I'm not going to. You don't need to remember them all. That's what maps are for. What you should remember is that there is a huge line that separates the place of the high mountains and the young rocks from the lowland east. And you should be able to draw it on a blank map whenever you see it. The second line has been described as the sagging hammock, and your butt is sitting right down there about in Cadillac, Michigan, I think. That's the line that separates where it can freeze in June from where it probably can't freeze in June. And it stops when you reach the west, because in the west, the rules are completely different. The line separates the east into the northern region that's too cold for farms and a warmer region where people could grow food if they've got enough water and a good enough soil and all the other stuff you might need. The third line runs due north from the tip of Texas, and it separates the rainy east where trees can grow from the mid-plains where there's not quite enough rain for trees, and so the natural vegetation was grasses. Here again, the western region is a little bit more complicated because the western region has got a lot of high mountains. The mountain tops tend to be colder and rainier and have trees on them, and the mountain bottoms tend to be warmer, drier, and be deserts or grasslands. And notice how the last 2 lines that I've just drawn basically outline the part of North America that has got a lot of rural settlement in it. The satellite image of the nighttime with the lights. There's a few urban areas. The PowerPoint explains that. The last line runs right through the middle of the farming region. Just basically due east-west over there. This is where the frost-free season is 7 months long, and that is important for 2 reasons. One is cotton and one is rice. That those 2 crops need at least 7 months of a growing season or they can't grow. Oh, and also north of the line, people pay more for heating than air conditioning. South, air conditioning is more expensive. And it goes on to explain why this was important in history, because slavery could only be profitable where you had a really high value crop like cotton. So that's it. It's 4 lines, divides North America into a western mountain region, a northern cold region, a Great Plains grass, a southern cotton pine, and a Great Lakes farm region, and a Central American hot and hilly region down here. Now, you might even want to turn this PowerPoint around and show them pictures. The western mountain region looks like that, the northern cold region, the Great Plains grass. In other words, you could lead with the pictures if you wanted to. Or you could show a map like this. When you were asking about map skills, this is just what Dave meant, like we build the map skills in all the way along. So can you remember where to draw the lines? And we can draw them on a satellite image. Does this work? And this is a 6th grade student that did not know that a pop quiz was coming 2 weeks after they showed the PowerPoint. And the 6th grade This was the average student in that class, according to the teacher. And there's another one. In other words, if you run through the PowerPoint or have them run through it, they will get this idea. Now, a geographic region isn't a real thing out there. It's what we get when we draw lines to put similar places into groups. So there are people that want to talk about something called the Desert Southwest. And I mentioned right at the beginning, that's where my little baloney meter kind of goes up into the purple zone a little bit, like these noble Indians that were surviving in the Desert Southwest. If you think that makes it easier to remember, fine. But I suggest it is easier and more accurate to remember that in the West, deserts are in all of the lowlands and forests are in all of the highlands. Even when you go all the way, well, I don't even want to do that. I'm going to stop. There's the Pueblos at Mesa Verde. And they didn't live in the desert Southwest. They lived in a forest. And in fact, they were protected from enemies by the fact that there was a desert around their forest. But on the mountain where they lived, it was a forest. And in fact, the temperature in July and the temperature in January and the total amount of rainfall and the total amount of snowfall in the Mesa Verde Indian settlement is exactly the same as Zeeland, Michigan, right outside of Holland. To say that they didn't live in the desert Southwest is a simplification that hides an important part of the truth. So there's the numbers that you've got, the temperature through the years, and there's the amount of rain and snow, and you can't tell me which of those stripes is Zeeland and which of those stripes is Mesa Verde, because the climate of those two places is absolutely identical. Meanwhile, we talk about the Pacific Northwest as being rainy, and this is a picture of something called Dry Falls in the middle of the Pacific Northwest. It's a desert. So all regional maps are generalizations. And sometimes we use words where we keep saying it even though we know it's not true. But a simple line can help us organize. Dave, do I got about 2 more minutes yet?
Take it away, Phil.
Go for it. So here are the daytime and the satellite images again. Can you see the regions? Can you draw that line there? And the sagging hammock? And the grassland versus forest line? And the cotton versus corn line? And you put the same ones over here. Now, a mental map like this can help you organize a whole lot of environmental information that you don't need to memorize that. I'm going to give you 2 very simple examples, and these are not for 5th grade. These are for adults. There's a map of German immigrants in 1898. And the sagging hammock, and the wet, dry forest and grassland line, and the corn and cotton line. There's a map of people who did not have health insurance in 2000. Because what Dave says is the big compelling question of this unit is geography destiny? And in some ways, in the United States, geography is destiny in terms of where your ancestors came from, what crops you grow now, what your economy is like, and even when you are likely to have health insurance. Now, if you want to go and look at a few more things like that, here's a map of what people call, because the Coke and Pepsi line shows up here. Here's a map of religion in the United States, a map of high school graduation rates, a map of, you're going to be teaching your kids with this unit something that they can use for the rest of their life to help them interpret maps of, well, I don't know, what are the swing states in the next election? We make regional maps to put places together. On a blank map of North America, 4 lines can organize a lot of information. So what I tried to do with those 3 PowerPoints was to say, when your kids get dropped on the square, and their job is to find out, what do we do in this place in order to survive? If you want them to go and look at the clickable map to get more information and make an inquiry activity out of it, go for it. They're going to want to go play around to find out how they survive. So